Hi, Daniel.
Julie, hi, how are you?
Good. So I invited you to talk about family and all the surrounding topics because you wrote this book, Psychoanalysis and the Politics of the Family, and you generally develop this topic. So let's maybe start with defining family. How would you define family? And I understand that it's important thing to define it.
Hmm. Well, I suppose you have to disentangle the historical background of the fact that family is really mostly in most societies kind of an economic exchange. Um, it has to do with stabilizing intergroup relations, civic relations. It's actually sort of a debate amongst the historians of the family when love became the central ideal of um, of uh, of marriage and family. This is like a huge question, actually, because some people think that love, well, in ancient societies, was extremely disruptive to the idea of marriage and family. And you had like this evolution, really starting, I think, in the 19th century of what they call the Victorian family in the West, and this Victorian family is notoriously, like if you read Foucault's The History of Sexuality, a repressive family which was putting sentimentality as the primary ideal of the family bond, of the marriage bond. Um, but it was the 20th century that put sexuality as the primary ideal. And so part of what we are living in the wake of today is the disillusion of that in a certain way. And I would argue perhaps the return to something more of an economic based um, arrangement. We're also witnessing the decline of marriage and family in very mysterious ways, in some sense. So there's certainly a crisis of the family, just like in Christianity they have this idea that um, at any given time the world is about to end. You have also the idea of the good news of that ending of the world is also the coming kingdom of God. So there's a sense of a permanent crisis. And so every generation feels almost narcissistically like their crisis is unique. And then you look back and you say, oh, well, actually, every generation saw their situation as uniquely crisis ridden, and the family has been in a crisis. So the question I think first has to be answered sort of how do you disentangle all of the historical dimensions here, especially I think the number one issue, frankly, is the decline of the breadwinner family and the question of patriarchy, the um, the fact that in the 1950s you had some 60% of uh, families in the United States, for example, experiencing a highly stable middle class life. You had the infusion of social welfare on an unprecedented scale. Um, you really, what caused sexuality to become the primary ideal was birth control. So the introduction of birth control in about the 1920s permitted sexuality to, but again, the fact that sexuality becomes so central to marriage and family is extremely new. And the ancients, Chinese, Indian, Roman society always saw love and sexuality as this irrational force, which really disrupted marriage. So marriage bonds have always been about this super pragmatic economic arrangement, you know? And even, like Plato's Symposium is talking about love, but not necessarily the idea that you could domesticate romantic love. Well, that always remained irrational. He's talking about the love of philia, the love of like brotherly love, civic love, you know? So you have to sort of understand that there's something strange that occurs when romantic love is domesticated. Maybe there's something strange that happens to the irrationalism of love itself. Like, why would you want to domesticate this irrational thing? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, so it paradoxically still at this point you would claim that, not paradoxically, but counterintuitive, that family can be the site of emancipation. How do you see it? Like how is it possible?
So that's another question because I think you have an interesting thing historically emerge, which is psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis emerges at the point at which the family bond becomes centered on the ideal of romantic sexual bond. And obviously, the popular appraisal of Freud has, and even with like Wilhelm Reich, some of his followers have always tended to portray psychoanalysis as a science of sexuality or as trying to conquer the irrational drives that sort of impede social stability. Civilization and its discontents discusses this. But in reality, psychoanalysis shows that the bonds of family are not necessarily governed by irrational love bonds, romantic love bonds, but they are governed by ambivalent attachments to paternal figures. And so then psychoanalysis charts a theory or a sort of path for how the psychic life of individuals can overcome those ambivalent attachments. And this is what Freud names the Oedipus complex, and which really revolves around that notion of emancipation, right? This notion of liberation from the family psychically. And that is sort of a very interesting debate because I think one of the things that happens in capitalist society, of course, is labor discipline, the requirements of um, wage labor, concurrent to the dissolution of the breadwinner family, actually make the family a paradoxical haven from the degradation of labor. And so this is a trend we've seen start really since the dawn of the early sexual revolution in the 1920s. I mean, you have to realize that in the early 20th century, the working class, in distinction to the middle class, was really for the first time permitted to experiment with forging marriage bonds through romantic love. Most of the time, the romantic bonds of the working class were not forged through romantic love. They were forged through familial arrangements of economic need and necessity to maintain the practical regeneration of the family unit. And so what you have occur is a what some scholars of the family call the privatization of the family, or another way to put that would be the kind of bourgeoisification of the family. And what that means is that the ideals of the middle class family um, become ubiquitous and they become the standard, they become the norm. And that creates a kind of conflict. You could call it a class conflict that is pervasive in society over the challenge and the struggle for people to attain those ideals, right? So, like in the 40s and 50s, we had this idea of the happy family and all of the pressures that came from meeting the certain metrics of retaining the happy family. You have to stay together, you have to meet certain income marker points, you have to ensure that you're productive members of society and so on. So there's also this great backlash to the construct of the middle class family that begins to really happen in the 1960s. Um, and since that time, we've seen, especially with the sexual revolution, and importantly, no fault divorce. I mean, no fault divorce as a legal construct has fundamentally changed the face of the family, right? So there's all of these historical points you have to contextualize when you're understanding the family. I mean, I think, but again, for me, when you say emancipation, um, the point I think of Freud and of psychoanalytic theories of the family are interesting to me because what they show is that psychic liberation, right? Like you do analysis. One of the things you learn when you do analysis, I myself do Lacanian psychoanalysis. You learn really that your symptoms are tied up with your family. You're not a monad. You're not purely individualized. You have to actually incorporate your family. Lacan had the idea that there's sort of three generations that are essential when unraveling um, a neurotic or even a psychotic. So you have to therefore incorporate um, the symptoms of really not only your parents but also your grandparents, frankly, right? Um, and so I mean, we can talk about that because that's something for me that um, makes the family something not to be fetishized or necessarily celebrated, but rather faced as a kind of realist, in a realist way, in a realistic way, as this sort of site of a kind of ambivalent freedom. Because on the one hand, the family introduces you to leisure time, it introduces you to non instrumentalized forms of love and care for the first time. And the family, therefore, becomes something like your early training ground for a non instrumentalized or even a universal conception of how to be a citizen, how to care for others, and so on. So it's this kind of side of a dispensation of virtue, a side of a dispensation of values, a side of a dispensation of traditions. And one of the things that's very interesting historically is that, the 1950s, precisely through um, the influx, I'm speaking here primarily of a Western European and American context, of such profound social stability, unprecedented social stability. Um, the family became kind of overloaded with contradictions, with social contradictions, despite that stability. And the family became a site of a very profound revolt, a revolt against, and some scholars have even said that it really started with men, that the breadwinner construct itself was extremely suffocating, you know? And that then led to a feminist, right? So both men and women at the apex of the stable family, of the breadwinner family, which we now see as a distant dream. It's not really realistic for us, for our generation. At the apex of that, everything dissolves. That is very interesting to me.
Mhm.
How you see my point? How it's not an anti-materialist point. I mean, I think but it's a question of study. It requires a historical analysis. Why did the breadwinner family? Why was it not sustainable? That's actually I don't know what you think about that.
It's interesting to think in the, and in your book, you're referring, not only in your book, but you write about therapy culture and partially discussing how family works because now our culture is therapeutic. And in this therapy that we have, the therapeutic psychologized society, it basically serves maybe capitalism and the way marriage is seen within it. It's those the instrumentalized, you can say. Um, Points where love and marriage it becomes the aimed at maximizing pleasure, satisfying emotional needs, and boosting self-esteem, something like it. And it maybe separates, I'm thinking, us from each other to a certain extent. It's about us being separated from each other. And the therapy you're suggesting, it's the psychoanalytic maybe therapy, which might be this praxis of emancipation, is actually in some way opposite in the sense that it works within the connection. And also what you write about the crisis of initiation. There's something operating on a level of society or those bonds within society, that one of which maybe the crucial one could be the family unit. So it's against, in a way, capitalism, this utility, instrumentalization of care and of everything exists in there.
Yeah, it's true. It's there's a kind of German sociological literature that I'm very interested in, even though it is not necessarily Marxist, which argue that really uh, class, economic class, has been eclipsed through what one scholar, Rekowitz, calls the society of singularities.
Mhm.
And the idea there is that um, the demand, or even the command, of self becoming, of self realization, is for each member, each citizen, each subject to, in fact, realize their highest singular self. And this means that marriage uh, really now is delayed, is postponed, is seen as an impediment to singularization, to self singularization, and it's therefore subordinated. Um, and therefore, this opens up a whole psychic question, you could say, because what you are removing there is something like a connection to a familial tradition, and you are sort of creating a society of a certain enome, of a certain alienation.
Mhm.
Um, and this becomes a this actually, even though we say that they are, I just said that it's sort of opposed to economic class. The realization, though, at the other on the other end, is that actually this reproduces a class conflict precisely through the fact that it's unfulfillable, precisely through the fact that this self-singularization is not available to everyone. And so what ends up happening is you basically have a two-tier social order of people who are kind of realized and people who have not been able to be realized. And this is concurrent to trends starting in the 1970s of what's called assertive marriage, where the trends used to be from the 50s to the 70s that actually, because of social welfare affordances, people actually married across their class positions of origin. But since the late 1970s to the present, in what's called the neoliberal revolution, that's no longer the case. And it's also true that working class people, lower class people, people in poverty, are now much more prone to getting divorced at much higher rates. So they get married more, but they also get divorced a lot more, and they get married earlier than middle class counterparts. Um, so yeah, so in some sense, that's to me a very interesting fact, right? Which is a clash. We're sort of witnessing the family as a clash over a frustrated working class clinging to the stable ideals of the old breadwinner family, even though they're not necessarily trying to say, maybe some of them are, but most of them aren't. Oh, we must enforce patriarchy. We must bring back the strong man into the family. They're not really saying that. What they're arguing for is a demand that the family function as a source of singularization for their lives. For example, even though if you watch like the news and you see the media, you may think that people are very opposed to the idea of the family. But if you actually ask people, do they would they see their lives as complete if they didn't have a family? The vast majority, I think over 80%, say they would not see their lives as complete if they didn't have a family. So there's something that remains. Um, and I would argue that it is that psychoanalytic point about attachments to our own families that helps us resolve something. So it's almost like the family can only be conquered by yourself experimenting with it as a form for yourself in order to overcome it. Otherwise, um, if you repress it, if you disavow it, if you keep it to the margins, it's not necessarily helping you conquer the family. So this idea of the family as being something which you both have to inhabit but also disinhabit at the same time is, I think, very important. You know, you have to honor that in a way which doesn't result in some type of authoritarian embrace of the family, which of course is true. I would say a lot of the Trump movement has an authoritarian embrace of the old breadwinner family. They may not conceive of it in a precise historical way. It may be very convoluted for them, but that is actually what they wish for, right? For some type of return to that, you know.
So what do you think will happen with the family in the worst case scenario, and what are the possibilities that one need to work for to prevent it, maybe?
It's very interesting because the legal rights of gay marriage and even of illegitimate children. I mean, keep in mind my earlier point that the family has functioned to legitimate divisions of labor, to define kind of normative practices of gender hierarchy. Historically, it's always functioned that way. What we've seen since the dawn of the 21st century is a profound legal progressivism, right? That is granting huge rights to non normative sexual expression as legitimate bonds of marriage, right? And now in many Western European countries, um, uh, basically partners that are not married are more and more supervising young children. So I think we're going to see an explosion of a move away of a kind of radical model of free choice for the arrangement of family units. I don't think, precisely because capitalism doesn't allow this, I don't think that a utopian solution of a commune family will ever be. I experimented with that in my book, as you may remember, as an idea. It's an old utopian socialist idea from the 19th century that you could have a kind of communal alternative to the bourgeois middle class family. But I don't think that capitalism permits it, actually. Uh, what capitalism will require is the companionate structure. Um, and you can even see that the decisions of the Supreme Court are also now moving, at least in the United States, towards an enforcement of greater social reproductive rights. Even though we have austerity for the vast majority of the middle and working classes, even though we have a cost of living crisis, etc., one of the things that the ruling class will require is that the birth rate remain high to fulfill labor needs, right? So, however you resolve that, it has to be resolved, right? So, I don't see the Western family unit going the way of China. China as putting limits on how many children. I think on the opposite, the policymakers in the West are going to want to increase that, you know. Um, then I think you have to ask yourself, like, what is the loss of these non-traditional marriage units? And I would say that really, really, there is no loss. In fact, I think experimentations in family form of heterosexual, of gay, of you name it, are rich. They offer a sort of rich opportunity. I mean, keep in mind that no fault divorce, I think, emerged only within the last 50 years, you know, or even cross racial marriages only happened within the last 60, 70 years. So, in some sense, we're in uncharted territory. And I think I wonder, like, if I said, the bond of marriage used to be sort of sentimental in 19th and then sexual in 20th, right? I'm not sure what the new bond of the 21st century will be. But one thing I would say is that what we're witnessing is that perhaps it is becoming more materially and economically and pragmatically centered, precisely as a result of economic precarity itself, which is a trend that, again, has been really present in family studies from 1973 to the present. Like basically what we're seeing is kind of like a new class division internal to the family. And from a Marxist point of view, is partially why I'm interested in studying the family, you know? Yeah.
Let's maybe also talk about the figure of the father. Like what was it initially in psychoanalysis and what it's becoming now, and what is this emancipation possible with the figure of the father?
Yeah. I mean, if you read um, psychoanalytic literature in the early period, in the Freudian period, you do find a sense of an authority. Uh, well, in Freud's group psychology, in his social writings, group psychology analysis of the ego, Moses and monotheism, in these texts, civilization's discontents, Freud makes an argument that social bonds are founded off of the affect of love for father. And it's no different, obviously, in the family structure. Um, that conception, though, at the same time, um, many have argued, was a sort of projection on behalf of Freud's own individual neurosis, in some sense, right? There's this great example of Freud's revolutionary dream of his own father, which is a highly political dream. I don't know if you're familiar with this in the interpretation of dreams. It's basically this story about how Freud um, is fleeing this aristocrat who is persecuting him, and he's taking these different trains to try to escape this man. And he ends at a train station where he witnesses his own father publicly humiliating himself by urinating in public. And Freud then like continues to run away. And I've offered interpretations of this particular dream. The fact that Jacques Lacan doesn't address this dream has always bothered me, because I would have always loved to see what Lacan would say about this dream. But part of the analysis that I offer and that others have offered is Freud actually is interested in a social stabilization of a social order in which the father's authority can help stabilize the social order, not just the family, because he's thinking the family as this unit which transcends just its own purview. It's kind of like a microcosm. And so Freud ultimately, in this dream, if you study the political context in which the dream is taking place, it's actually a revolutionary context. That's why it's called revolutionary dream. And what Freud is actually anxious about is the aristocrat losing his power. So this is sort of Freud's liberalism, sort of status quo liberalism in a certain way, which is that Freud ultimately wants a rapprochement between the ancien regime. And this is also really related to Freud's comments on communism and Bolshevism, for which he was actually mostly, it really made him anxious. Bolshevism made him anxious. And as such, my reading of Freud's politics at this level is that he's trying to concoct a solution. It's not necessarily anti-revolutionary. Like, there is actually a whole literature that we could open up about psychoanalysis and revolution, which is valid. But I think that Freud's father is really a father that's trying to stabilize a chaotic social order. Chaotic primarily because of left-wing revolutions. Subsequent psychoanalysts have challenged the Freudian model of the father. And I think most importantly for me is Lacan's notion of the name of the father, which is this notion that um, capitalism is actually eroding the authority of the father figure in profound ways. And that in reality, the father clinically is a function of, well, helping the subject to resolve an impasse of their own desire. And as such, this idea of a biological father as a father that initiates you out of some type of depression or some type of impasse of your desire. No, Lacan says actually this father figure is really a metaphor. It's like could be multiple figures. And so you think then of a kind of broadened idea of the name of the Father as some figure that helps you invent a new desire. That is the Lacanian idea of the Father. In some senses, it's a very progressive idea of the Father. And this is why so many feminists have been attracted to Lacan, because he's trying to say that Freud's model of authority is no longer historically relevant. And this is concurrent to his discourse theory in the late 1960s. And in the discourse theory, specifically in Seminar 17, Lacan will make an argument really that Freud made a misreading of the father's role as the catalyst of the social bond. And Freud moves away from the idea that the father is the glue of the social bond. He moves away from it. At the same time as he moves away from it, he also warns his students and other psychoanalysts and philosophers and others that are in his seminars that civilization is still in a state of a discontent over the loss of the father. So it's not as if it's perceived as a great liberation. That's why he has a seminar, The Father or Worse. And so he does want to point out that civilization's moving to a paradigm that will experience pretty profound psychopathological effects of the decline of the father. And then it becomes a question about how we historicize that. Um, I think it also becomes a question of the ethics of nostalgia for father authority, because we don't want to have a situation where we have a kind of ultra leftism, which is sort of um, desirous of eliminating fathers completely. Because the truth of the father's role, I think, in modern society is that they are fated to play the role of a humiliated father. That in fact, their authority is normatively weakened. And it's well known. It's not a secret. It's not a surprise, right? So the idea of a father assuming the mantle of the pater familias, where obedience is commanded, well, we all know that this has been abandoned decades ago. It's no shock. And we also know that it's actually good that this has been abandoned decades ago. Part of the struggle, I think, of modern families is how to negotiate that problem, how to negotiate the sort of psychic attachments we have to, or even needs that we have, that a father exert a more classical form of authority, while at the same time recognizing that there's so many profound social taboos from that very exertion. So that becomes the site of, I think, a localized site of conflict that every family has to negotiate. You know, there's no one answer, there's no one resolution to it. It's a constant give and take. You know, it's a site of a profound abuse, of a profound trauma, but also of a sort of progressive opening, all at the same time.
I was waiting to ask this question. I think this is the right moment about your own family, because my comprehension of the world, I think we all think through what we have through our bodies and through our families, through our immediate environment, and mine is different. I comprehend myself as a mother and everything else through this concept of motherhood. For me, father is like absent already figure. Strangely, this is just how it organically, in a way, how I think was in my situation. But your situation, you are this strange creature to me that I'm trying to understand your own thinking. And then, you are the father, still, maybe humiliated father. You have family, you have children, and as long as I know, you have cat and wife, like all these things that family requires. So you have this own side of thinking, different context from mine. And how would you see your, like, this practical environment? Who are you as a father, and how do you work in this dimension of, or direction of, emancipation within your own family? Are you humiliated father?
Yeah. No, it's true. Well, I mean, I think There's a great Catholic playwright that Lacan always uh, evokes called Paul Claudel, and he wrote a series of books about the decline of the traditional classical father. And one of the plays was called The Humiliated Father, which is a very interesting because he's a conservative Catholic. And so the question of the historical decline of the father's authority really, you have to understand also in Western Europe, it really, and in the United States as well, it's a political question, right? It's a political question that's has to be dialectically understood in the sense that this, keep in mind that the French Revolution itself was one of the most revolutionary, and even 1917 in Russia. Both revolutions infused a radical egalitarianism into the structure of the family and therefore usurped the father's authority. So I guess, there's so much to be said about that. And, to study the history of the family is to study the history of politics. They're inextricable. And, my own experience is one of class uh, difference and continuity, and I think a very perhaps unique or maybe not so unique way, in the sense that I've seen the decline of my grandparents' stable family into a very, very profound series of divorce and conflict and struggle with my mother and my father. And those experiences forced me to confront, in a classical way, uh, the meaning of the father outside of the family, actually. The meaning of the father. Um, what does it mean to be a father when everything in society breaks down? Do you flee entirely and say this whole construct should be abandoned? Or do you hold your ground and insist upon inserting inserting some kind of fatherly care into that situation? So for myself, it's my brothers. When I was very young, that kind of I played a fatherly role because I was the oldest. Um, and then I think the other experience of fatherhood for me came through a profound conflict that I had with my biological father, which I had a choice to resolve or not to resolve. And the input of my friends and family was split 50-50. Some said you should resolve it, others said you shouldn't because his violations were so extreme. And so I had to make a decision. And it was through psychoanalysis that I learned, or that I came to the decision to resolve my conflicts with him. Hindsight is 2020. You never know what the best decision is. But I felt that in order to repair myself, my psychic situation in the world, and I still feel this way, it was a good decision to. And now this has evolved to such an extent that my father actually is a part of my psychoanalytic practice. He attends my sessions, for example, from time to time. And so he is a work in progress that I have insisted on um, maybe teaching him the meaning of what it is to be a father. And that was actually an original Freudian insight, right? That because the father is this contingent function in society, that it is almost up for grabs. We don't know. It's not guaranteed that the biological father will actually be the one to play the father function for you. It's not guaranteed at all. Um, Therefore, you could talk about a multiplicity of father functions, and talk about them in such a way that is constructive, that is progressive, and that is aiding people in overcoming a chaotic situation or a miserable situation or whatever. So that's what the father means for me. I mean, for my wife, it means something completely different, you know. And I think you always have to contend with the clash that emerges there. And I think perhaps you could even say unconsciously, we are drawn to people in part. Um, like, for example, I mean, I wonder for you, are you drawn to romantic partners who also have experienced an absent father? Or perhaps you're drawn to partners to compensate, and you're drawn to partners who have a present father and do not have a narrative of a profound absence, you know? Maybe you're drawn to both forms. Right? I think for me, um, with my family and my wife, we share a highly similar background in unstable father figures. And that has actually been something that's been mixed. Has been the source of a profound kind of glorious overcoming, but also challenges, you know? I actually would say, Julie, that I don't know if I could handle being in a marriage with somebody from a happy family. I don't think it could work for me. Um, I could only have solidarity with someone who has shared these types of struggles that I've experienced, you know? But that again goes back to this notion of, well, is the bond of my marriage really about romantic love, or is it about something deeper? Is it about a reparative gesture, right? With someone who shares something at this psychic level.
Mhm.
And maybe that's more what marriage should be. I say should, maybe more that's what it is. Maybe that's just how marriage is. Like I was even reading recently that they have um, in some cultures put a premium. In other words, it's encouraged to marry someone who you have more conflict with because you know the marriage is going to have an inevitability of conflict. So you need to find someone for whom you have a frequency of conflict where conflict becomes therefore kind of like manageable, you know? It's interesting, right? I mean, maybe some of the best marriages have that frequency because frequency does not necessarily mean um, negative. No, I mean it could also be the more conflict. The question with conflict is to me always about how is it going to be resolved? On what basis is it resolved? What basis is it an impediment? I would be terrified, and I am terrified of couples who kind of conceal their conflict. I don't know about you, or like that's always a question, right? Which is like we have these conflicts, but um, how do they not overwhelm us? I don't know how you feel about this. I know I've shifted the question entirely, and I apologize. Um, I've I have the tendency to do that.
Yeah, I totally agree with the idea that there is no, again, this might be my trauma, but for me, relationship is pain and love is pain. It's like inseparable. And from this position, if you want to include fathers in it, maybe father is always absent, even if they're present. And maybe the authority, there was never authority, there was just the way of compensating this authority. Now they are through the kind of trying to establish authority. And now fathers who are deprived of this kind of compensation illusion that they are authority. For me, even mother is absent, even though she's physically present. We all have mothers, like we were all in a womb physically. But nonetheless, there is something that rather works as a compensation, trying to deal with this absence, the loss, initial lack of them, that embracing the lack, the impossibility of have this caring, loving someone. And around the lack and the loss of this caring figure, father or mother, we establish this is how bond work, like mourning, trying to substitute and failing always, but again, just embracing the lack of it. And I will betray myself probably and regret later, but maybe there is more power of emancipation in a figure of father than of mother, because they are deprived of this authority, because they're more dispersed. Because I think that in um, structurally the ethical demands for both mother and being a real man and being a father are actually same. Like you just have to care, and you have to, it has to be about someone else. You have to be caring instance, deprived of self absorption. But um, father might be more in the world where we don't have this illusion of father authority anymore, when fathers are not allowed to have it. Maybe mothers start to substitute it, the authority figure, and father remains more dispersed, less kind of dangerous figure who's still mother. I mean, still the caring, with the demand of being caring person, something like it. Maybe father is always absent, and maybe this is how it's all structured, and maybe this is how it's the father is actually present, being and humiliated. You know, you can never redeem this humiliation. This from this position, this the only position you're functioning. Yeah,
Well,
so
the father also has to be killed, right? So
he's
this
already
is,
dead.
he's already dead, but he also has to be killed in order for the new desire to be developed. This is sort of the notion of the Oedipal conflict, which is very, I think, accurate, you know? It's this notion that Freud bequeaths to us in Totem and Taboo, and this idea that society is founded off of the murder of the of what he calls primal father, and the idea there is sort of one of exchange of enjoyment. The primal father has to be murdered because society is organized around the command of his enjoyment and his possession of all of the women. And it's only through the murder and then the pact, then the bond of the brothers in the wake of the murder, for a fair distribution. And we're not going to repeat the way that he distributed enjoyment. We're going to make it individualized. It's like Freud gives you this archaic idea of the birth of modernity out of this myth.
Mm.
And it's totally a myth. I mean, it's questionable anthropologically, historically, whether, of course, something like this happened. Uh, but at the level of myth and metaphor, still the relationship between, say, father son, still possesses this. In other words, the humiliation of the father does need to uh, and is enacted, right, as a way for um, realizing the autonomy of one's jouissance. You could say it like that, or one's enjoyment. It's kind of like this. It's kind of like a profound. I mean, Alain Badiou, my philosophical mentor, has this essay that he wrote, very personal, about his relationship to his boys, some of which are adopted, some of which are biological. And he showed that um, in order for them to be men, there was actually usually some kind of physical violence between him and them. You know, so that's kind of a reality we can't shy away from. Symbolic, physical, let's say symbolic violence, some kind of, you know, and you see, I mean, you see with, I mean, with girls as well, but it's different. I think the Oedipal stage is different, but it's also present. That the father function doesn't necessarily need to be biological, but there is this constitutive aggression. Now, in Lacanian view, the father is what helps us escape the suffocation of the mother's desire. Like this suffocation of the mother's desire, the father helps you kind of get an outside to that. And so naturally, if in society fathers are not allowed to play that function to help you move from there, um, one of the problems is that the mother becomes both father and mother, you could say.
Mm.
Or the mother becomes a sadistic superego, uh, which has to be fought. And then the father is kind of an untouchable. That's also, I think, a structure that I've seen. So there's a lot of ethical issues too, because one of the things I talk about in my book is this idea of the new configuration of the superego being more like the mother than it is like the father, right? Because in Freud's time, the superego was very much a fatherly superego. And a lot of theorists like Christopher Lasch and others have said that really the superego of modern capitalism is the mother, the cruel, sadistic mother. Even Zizek talks about this. I don't know what you think about that. Kind of goes to your point, though. Um, do you think that's how it is? Like because if that's true, then that's very difficult for the mother to bear. Do you agree?
I'm thinking that in this comprehension of what is mother is still largely based on thinking about the father and how father is initially and how subject is initially defined as individualized or in need of separation. But I'm thinking that if you rely, for example, on Braha-Ettinger comprehension and development of what is mother, and she's quite radical in staying away from this father male-centered comprehension. The mother comprehension of a mother would be just different. It won't include the logic of separation. It won't include the logic of authority, and even that much of sexuality the way it was defined. So it's quite different logic if you start with mother initially on this maternal matrixial matrixial structure of what the whole thing is. But I wonder where how father fits into, like if you start with the mother, thinking about the mother without using those concepts of authority and separation and desire even, how would where does father fits? And it doesn't doesn't probably fit. It fits just one of the like one of the instances within this mother structure, which
Hmm.
is problematic in this perspective, I admit.
Or actually, it could be reversed. And I think with the economic patterns of marriages, you could have a reversal where effectively the mother is a sunk father, playing the sunk father function in a classical sense, and the father's playing the motherly role. I've seen this arrangement in my own family and others as well. So I think it's what's interesting about psychoanalytic ideas that allows us to symbolically show how these roles and functions um, mutate and they shift, and there's nothing necessarily stable about them. There are like these social historical trends, and we can speculate and we can theorize about them. I do think, though, that politically speaking, I don't know if you agree, we still have quite a lot of psychopathological instability and violence over the uh, confusion and the ambivalence of these relations. And so, therefore, that's why I insist that something like the Oedipus uh, structure needs to remain something that we think through. I'm not necessarily in favor of this idea that we're fully post, that we're out of it, that we're outside of that. I don't know what you think about that. I mean, you had just talked about Braca Ettinger, and I think there's a lot of psychoanalysts that are even starting with Wilhelm Reich. I mean, that was when Wilhelm Reich gave his lectures on psychoanalysis in the Soviet Union way back, I think in the, oh gosh, 1930s, perhaps, maybe 40s. He was arguing really that socialist society will have overcome the Oedipus complex as Freud theorized it. And I just wonder if this is actually a problematic that we can fully transcend. And I wanted to ask you perhaps what you think about that.
I'm just confused. I don't really think. I'm just getting lost. But I mean, not with you, just in general, in life, what is happening and in theory. But it's interesting to think about the crisis of initiation, how you define it, and it's defined differently from, well, maybe initial comprehension, how we think about initiation into society. Um, I would maybe try to think against the separation, the idea of separation, that one needs to be separated, because for me it implies the separation from the family, and mother, precisely. Mother is comprehended here as a primitive something one needs to abandon. And from my perspective, there is another stage of becoming a parent, of becoming non-separated, like embracing family back again, including your mother. It's just the strange logic that for me, that that I would articulate, that in order to you need to become your mother, non-separated, to become a mother. Become your mother to become a mother. There's strange movement back to non-separation in order to become a mother. So there's where would initiation, I wonder, fit here in this strange comprehension where there is no separation required, but rather something opposite of separation. And the way you offer the concept of initiation and where you fit the father in relation to this initiation, it might be seen also as this point, not necessary separation, betrayal of mother, seeing her as primitive, something in order to overcome, but also as strangely coming back to mother, the opposite of separation. Like this initiation, the initiation we associated with getting back into society, being initiated from society, from your family, from you being separated, which is not, you just non-separated, rather you're part of the mother still. There is something about the dual thing about the initiation, which you become, like it's opposite to itself, it's opposite to separation. And maybe this is where father fits, kind of not the movement of separating, betraying father through becoming part of society, but the movement in maybe two directions, going back to non-separation and establishing something opposite rather to separation. This is strange logic.
No, it's very true. I suppose the triangle of the Oedipus structure, there's been so much political interest on the left to challenge the structure itself. And I feel that one of the things, like Bruno Bettelheim in his work on initiation argues, is that like there still is, yes, there is this crisis of initiation, but the crisis of initiation of modern capitalism is born from the fact that capitalism has commodified social bonds to such an extent and instrumentalized familial social bonds to such an extent that it's sort of left us all orphans. It's kind of left us all as dejected subjects.
Mhm.
And therefore, we sort of wander. We wander the world with this radical choice available to us. And we have all of these social taboos built up about, like, this idea of like what it means to have subjective independence as requiring a return from the separation, because the separation into adulthood, starting your career, all of these questions that open up the horizon of a profound possibility of nihilism, of aimlessness, of what am I going to do with my life? Uh, there does have to be a return to the question of the family, I think. And I think for all of us, we navigate it in different ways. One thing that interests me is the idea of chosen parents. Uh, in a certain sense, my question for chosen parents would be, is there actually a psychic liberation that is occurring? Because one of the things that happens with this becoming orphan of our lives is precisely because we're interpolated into a family with a history, like I said about the three generations and all of that. I think there does need to be a return to a resolution of a confrontation with that history,
Mm.
no matter what. And for some of us, the stakes are very high. For some of us, the stakes are quite low. There's a kind of inequality about that return. But we all have to return to the question of facing that, I think, in some sense, you know? And perhaps for me, one of the reasons why I feel that I have a knowledge about this issue is because I was forced into a kind of socialized, like the family was very socialized for me. And this is something that we realize about the working class in history. That working class subjects have always had to deal with a highly socialized family. They didn't, again, it was early 20th century and the working classes were introduced to the private, Victorian, bourgeois, middle class family. Most of the time for like Easter and Thanksgiving and Christmas, you didn't celebrate it with your family. You celebrated it with your community. This is highly communal. And I
Mm.
think perhaps with the dissolution of private family, middle class family, we find the test of the metaphorical bonds of like, could a father or a mother really just be anybody, you know? Or is there a meaning in the biological, right? What is the anguish that comes from denying that facing of the entanglement of the family? What is the privilege that comes with not having to face the family entanglement? So, you know, that's a question for me, right? Which is about the completion of your psyche, the completion of, I know in Lacanian thought, there's not much onus put on the idea of psychic or structural completion. Everything, truth is always half said, right? There's this idea of the sexual relation is split, right? We are split at our core and so on. But despite that splitness, we still have a yearning for completion. We still have a yearning for the one, for the whole. And so I think perhaps, yeah, that's the question: is the family? Mm, the family does not give you the one, the whole. I mean, like, you know, I had this funny joke where Tolstoy said, "Family happiness consumes me so completely that I'm incapable of being productive." And I thought to myself, after having kids and a wife and everything, I'm like, in classic Zizeki, and I'm like, but what if the opposite is true? Like for me, it's true. Like actually, family happiness, when I can achieve it, actually makes me very productive. Like with my writing, you know, I'm much more productive when we have harmony. When there's disharmony, it harms me, you know. So it's also, I think, a question of responsibility, you know. The responsibility is not just for yourself, right? I mean, what does it mean to be the catalyst of the harmonization of others? It's a profound responsibility. I mean, that's the other thing that's very interesting is that the conservative ideology is very disingenuous, you know, because they had this idea ever since like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan came to power that like the federal government's budget is a metaphor of the family's budget. And so if we are in debt, like the family needs to mirror the state. We need to be austere. We need to be, uh, we need to push against consumerist hedonism. We need to be responsible family members. That itself is the dialectic of what I call the cultural unconscious, you know? This weird way in which internal to the family, uh, bourgeois politics and liberal politics plays itself out, you know? But that only becomes kind of like a facade or like an illusion because the whole construct of the state being akin to the family is ludicrous. But that's like the ideology of the family. The ideology of the family would have you think that it's the same. I don't know how it works where you're from, or I don't even know the political ideology of your parents. Because that's the other thing is that I noticed with my father, affectively, libidinally, we are both the same, politically speaking, creatures, as creatures. But ideologically, we are opposite. That's the other point about the Oedipus complex. Why Oedipus complex still has purchase or efficacy. You know, a good proof of that is the example of how, do you know what the concept of red diaper baby is? It's somebody who was raised by communists.
Mm.
Are you aware that basically baby boomers that raised Gen X, baby boomer communists that raised Gen X kids, most of the time, if they were like highly professional left wing communist parents, they produced highly conservative kids. And it's just an interesting fact of that opposite. But there's a similarity at the level of libido, at the level of intensity of affect. And so my father's affect politically, like for example, he's so passionate about politics that he would end a friendship over politics.
Mm.
Unfortunately, I'm the same way, you know, but ideologically, we're completely different. So there's something to this point, you know? I don't know how it works for you, but there's something to this, yeah, to the fact that the family actually maybe inculcates you at the level of enjoyment, desire, libido into a political repetition for which then the social order has a contingency regarding the ideology. The ideology may be different, but there's something shared at this level. I don't know if that makes sense, but something I've observed.
Family can be seen as also certain type of repetition, but also with the destructive difference to it. And certain things have to be repeat, but also like structurally, but certain things also uh, change, and maybe working with both the repetition like necessary and both changing something is the important thing. So preserving both, which sounds horrible.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's very strange too to see. Well, I mean, I think what psychoanalysis offers is a way because you know psychoanalysis has this idea of the name as having a certain purchase. Well, like, why does Lacan call it the name of the father? Well, part of that is the way that signifiers situate our subjectivity. And one of the signifiers that we like, Lacan has this idea. I don't know if you're aware of it. What he's referred to as keywords. In other words, in the individual analysis of any analyst, and over time, you will discover only a handful of words that possess uh, symbolic weight or meaning for you. And often those words also will be caught up phonemically with the name, with the first name or last name of family members.
Mm.
And so, for example, you can kind of identify the destiny of a subject when you have identified these words, because these words actually end up determining their actions. I'm not going to get into the details, but I've seen how this works myself, and it's quite powerful. Like it really makes me understand Lacan's idea of the power of the signifier. You know, maybe that's for a separate conversation. I know we're almost wrapped up, but this is something I've seen like the proof of in my own analysis. You know, and it made me a believer in psychoanalysis because that's the other thing that psychoanalysis a lot of people don't realize. Psychoanalysis, you have to actually produce a belief in the unconscious in order for psychoanalysis to have effect on you. That's one thing I learned. And like Lacan has this whole idea that, well, modern society, people no longer believe in the unconscious. That's a problem. You know, does that make sense? Like, in other words, in order for psychoanalysis to work, it has to be proven to you.
Mhm.
These slips of speech, these turns of phrase, these words that I repeat, I have to be shown how they're implicated in my subjectivity. Once that happens, then I really can begin a process of working on them. So it's almost like you have to make an inventory of your keywords in order for them to work or in order for them to be mastered by you and therefore maybe overcome or at least known. You know what I mean? I mean, the best example, of course, is that famous case of Lacan from the woman who associated the word boot with cheek. Do you know that story?
No.
It's a very famous story. I think there's a video of her telling the story. She was almost killed by a Nazi putting his boot on her face and pushing it into the mud, and she almost died. But she blocked it out. And instead, she phonemically connected, I think, I forget the French word of cheek or whatever, and she would repeat that in analysis. But then Lacan listened carefully and he associated the two. And then being able to, and then he like touched her cheek or whatever. That really helped her, that like actually was significant, for her cure.
It's interesting to actually analyze our conversation from this perspective, but we won't do it today because we ran out of time. There's something about therapeutic setting to the conversations too, probably. I will let you go for now, and I hope to talk again about everything else too. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Julie. Really appreciated it. Enjoyed it.
Thank